Welcome to the Flower Lounge, a place for conversations with wildly creative people and a little plant-loving wisdom to help you experience life in full bloom. I'm Katie Hess, flower alchemist and founder of LOTUSWEI, and I believe in a world where we're all living at our personal edge. Welcome to this week's episode of the Flower Lounge. We have an incredible resource with us for this podcast. David Winston is an herbalist and ethnobotanist with 49 years of training in Chinese, Western, Eclectic, and Southeastern herbal traditions. He's been in clinical practice for over 40 years and as an herbal consultant to physicians, herbalists, and researchers throughout the US and Canada. He's founder and director of the Herbal Therapeutics Research Library, and he's a dean at the David Winston Center for Herbal Studies, which is a 2-year training program in clinical herbal medicine. He is, of course, internationally known as a lecturer, and he frequently teaches at medical schools, symposia, and herb conferences. He's also the president of Herbalist and Alchemist Incorporated, a manufacturer that produces herbal products that blend the art and science of the world's great herbal traditions. And if that weren't enough, he's also the founding member of the American Herbalist Guild. And then I'm going to tell you all the books that he either is author or contributor to. American Herbalism, Saw Palmetto for Men and Women, Herbal Therapeutics, Adaptogens, Herbs for Strength, Stamina, and Supplements, Scientific and Traditional Approach, and the Botanical Safety Handbook. So obviously, this is a guy who really knows his stuff. Thank you so much for being with us, David.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Katie. Thank you so much for having me.
I love plant people. They're so humble. So let's see. We usually start out each podcast with a really short exercise where we just ask you to close your eyes and go back to a time in your childhood when you played around flowers or plants or trees. And just think about what you were doing at the time and who you were with. And see if you can identify a favorite flower or botanical. And then reflect on the 3 words you would use to describe its personality. And whenever you're ready, if you want to just share a little bit, you can open your eyes and share what you were thinking and what you were up to, what your favorite was, and what your 3 words were.
Well, I had a somewhat unusual childhood. Most of my friends were either plants or rocks, not a whole lot of people.
I love it. We have a lot in common already.
And I can remember being about maybe 4 years old and making medicine in my backyard.
Aww.
And nobody had ever told me about this. I would say that the plants told me. And I remember I did have this one friend who lived on a farm behind our house, and her name was Maury, and she was a little bit older than I was, so she might have been 6, and she hurt herself. And I told her not to worry about it, that I would make her some medicine.
Aww.
And it would make it all better. And the plant that was the medicine was plantain.
Oh, wow. Of course.
And I mashed it up. I think I put it on a rock and then mashed it with, put a bunch on a rock and mashed it up until it was kind of, stringy mess. And I put it on her arm.
Brilliant.
And told her that it would make her better. And of course, the 3 words for plantain, and I find it fascinating you use the word personality, because my uncle used to always talk about plants' personality, that each species of plant has a personality. And if you really want to understand the plant, you need to understand its personality. And so with plantain, I would say humble, because it is considered just to be this absolute lowly weed. It doesn't have beautiful flowers. It's not considered to be attractive, although I think it's a lovely plant and I have it all over my property. But so I would say it's humble, but it is also powerful. Mm-hmm. And it is powerful, though, and the 3rd word would be gentle, because a lot of people think powerful means it has to be really strong, potentially toxic, whatever. And that's not true. So plantain is this amazing vulnerary, and a vulnerary is a wound healing plant. And so it has a long tradition of being used topically for scratches, cuts, infections, boils, staph infections, but it's also used as a vulnerary internally, which is less commonly known. So it's also used for things like gastritis and gastric ulcers and duodenal ulcers and irritation of the urinary tract. And it can be used for things like inflammatory bowel disease. And if there's like not just diarrhea, but sort of blood in the stool, then you put the root of the plantain in there with it, because the root has some styptic qualities and helps stop bleeding. And so I would say it is gentle, powerful, and humble.
How perfect. So what we find is that how you would typically describe your childhood favorite would describe the ways in which you personally bring your gifts into this world. So humble, powerful, gentle, and an inner and outer wound healer. It sounds very much like you.
Well, I can honestly say I've never thought of myself that way, but thank you.
Wow. And I had no idea that the root of plantain was a styptic. That's so good to know.
Well, I just have this fascination for learning about plants that no one else uses, these plants that grow all around us. And I have to admit that some of my favorites are plants like nettles, where the leaf is a medicine, the root is a medicine, and the seed is a medicine, and they all do different things. And the same thing's true of mullein, where the root is a medicine, the leaf is a medicine, the flower is a medicine, and they all do different things. And these are just common, quote unquote, aggressive weeds, and they surround us. To me, that's just magnificent.
And isn't that nuts when one single plant has such a variety of healing benefits? It's like a whole pharmacy just in one plant alone.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wow. And so tell me more about your uncle. What was having him talk about the personality of plants, and how did that impact your way of seeing the botanical world?
Well, he's Native American, and he's actually a more distant relative than uncle would suggest. And I was fortunate enough, I started falling in love, and that's really what it was. I started falling in love with plants when I was about 13 years old. And I just thought it was so incredible that you could go out into the woods and fields and find food and medicine. And so I just started doing it. And it's really funny because like in the late 1960s, people would say to me, well, what do you do? And I'd say, I'm an herbalist. And they'd look at me like I had just told them I was an alien from another planet. And they would say, you mean like spices? And I go, no. And if they were really knowledgeable, they'd say something like, you mean like potpourri? And I go, no, medicinal plants. And they'd look at me shaking their head, and I could always tell they were sitting there thinking, poor misguided youth, why would you waste your time doing something that people used to do 100 years ago? It would be like me telling them I was learning to deliver blocks of ice for their ice box, or learning how to light the gas lamps at night. You know, people thought it was this extinct thing. But I was passionate enough, I was in love enough, and stubborn enough that I just kept doing it. And then as a teenager, I started spending time down in North Carolina with one of my uncles and an aunt of mine. My aunt was an herbalist, and my uncle did traditional medicine.
Wow.
And so I started learning from them. I mean, I'd already been learning on my own, but I also learned from them. And then over the years, I apprenticed with a Chinese doctor in New York, and I went to college and took, classes in anatomy and physiology and pharmacognosy and, cellular biology and all that kind of thing. And I just feel really blessed that I found my passion at a really early age, and I've spent my entire life doing it and sharing it. And to me, it's just the most marvelous thing.
You're so lucky to find it at such a young age. I wish I would have found flower essences at age 13. My goodness. It's so lucky. And then don't you also feel like, you've been at this for 49 years of training, but don't you also get the feeling sometimes that the more you know, the less you, not the less you know, but that there's just, it's like an infinite vast universe of botanical, like paradise that we'll never fully wrap our heads around, right?
Oh my, this conversation could go on for days, honestly. So what I tell people, and I'm kidding and I'm not kidding, what I tell people is after 49 years, I now feel comfortable calling myself an advanced beginner. And what I mean by that is that, yeah, I know a lot, but the more you know, as you just said, the more you realize how much there is to know. Literally, a week doesn't go by where a physician or one of my students doesn't come up to me with some question about some disease I've never heard of, or I learned something new about a plant, or I'm walking around my farm and I see a plant that's never been there before, and it just appears out of nowhere. And sometimes I know what it is, and sometimes it's like, well, who are you? And I have to figure out who it is. And that may send me off on a whole new direction of trying to figure out, well, where does this come from? And the people where it is native to, what do they use it for? It is endless. Now, some people might find that daunting, but as a person, I'm too old to have been diagnosed as a kid. But if I had been younger, I would have been diagnosed as having not only ADHD, more the ADD part, the attention deficit. When I was a kid in school, I majored in daydreaming. I mean, I was in class, but I was never in class. I mean, I was off having these, my daydreams can be as vivid as night dreams, and as well as being dyslexic. And so for me, the plants, as I was saying earlier, always felt like a stronger connection. I would always had challenges with people, especially being very young. It was hard to express that sort of thing. Nobody understood it. But if I was the kind of, if herbal medicine was a finite body of knowledge, I would have gotten bored and moved on to something else a long time ago. The fact that it is endless, to me, is really exciting. It means it doesn't matter how much I know, it doesn't matter how old I live to, there will still be more to learn than I know.
Oh my God, I'm so on the same page with you. It's like the constant evolution factor, right? I remember when I first started learning about flower essences, and I thought, damn, I could not only learn about them, but take them, and any human being on the planet could use them for the rest of their entire life and never hit a ceiling of, oh, well, I've maxed out my capacity. Mm-hmm. I've reached my full potential, and that's it. It's just like the excitement of the constant evolution factor. That seems like it's a value for you as well.
Mm-hmm. Do you want to hear a funny flower essence story?
Yeah, absolutely.
Actually, two.
Yeah.
So first off, of course, the first person who most people know about with flower essences is Dr. Richard Bach, right. Or Bach or Bach, depending on if you're in England, how they pronounce it, Bach, Bach. And of course, he was a brilliant man. And so I came across his work very early. I think I came across his work around 1970 or 71. Wow. And in order to get the Bach flower remedies, you used to have to send to England. They weren't available here. There was no distribution here. So you had to go to the Bach Center in England. And very early on, I had this idea. And I said, well, wait a minute. There are 38 flower remedies. What about all the rest of the flowers? Now, this is obviously, I was probably not the first person to have this idea, nor the last, because obviously there's many other flower essences now, the California essences, there's hundreds of them and whatever. But so I wrote a letter to the people who ran the Bach Center. Dr. Bach had passed away many years earlier.
Right.
And they used to publish a book on how to make the essences, but they stopped publishing that book because they didn't really want people making them themselves, because they said that you had to get it from the exact same plant or tree that Dr. Bach used. Okay. So, but I wrote them this letter, and a couple weeks later, I got back the nastiest proper British letter you've ever seen. And I still have this letter to this day. And they basically said to me, who did I think I was? Dr. Bach was a saint. And that, who was I to put myself in the same, league as him? And I was so crushed by this letter that I stopped my process of trying to figure out what all the other flowers were used for.
Oh my God.
But
Heartbreaking.
yeah, it kind of was, except that I had already come up with one. And the one, and I say I came up with it, that's not really accurate. The plant I had already learned one from the plant, and that was lady's mantle. And lady's mantle is not a flower essence exactly. It's more or less what's called an arborivital remedy. Now, here's the second piece, and then I'll get back to lady's mantle. Dr. Bach did not come up with the idea of flower essences. The person who came up with the idea of flower essences, the first person that we know about, is Dr. Richard Cooper. Dr. Richard Cooper was a homeopathic physician, and Dr. Bach was best friends with Dr. Richard Cooper's son. And this is where the idea of flower essences came from. Now, Dr. Cooper used them for physical things, for healing cancer and ear infections and stuff like that. And he made what he called arborivital remedies. He would take a plant that was in flower, he'd have a vial of water, he'd stick the living plant in flower into the vial of water, and in the full sun, and an hour of full sun was, he called 1x, 2 hours was 2x, 3 hours was 3x of potentiation of the flower essence. And then when you take the vial out, the flowers would be all faded, and all the energy and life force of the flowers would be gone, and you now had your arborivital remedy. So the arborivital remedies, that idea then goes to Dr. Bach, and he is taught by the plants his 38 remedies. So anyway, I was taught about one remedy, this being lady's mantle. And lady's mantle is, as in herbal medicine, used for profuse menstrual bleeding. It's used for a prolapsed uterus. It can be used for urinary incontinence, especially for women who've had like 3 or 4 children or more. And so, and the thing about lady's mantle, the Latin name is alchemilla, and from the word alchemist, because in the morning after the dew settles on lady's mantle, it settles all around the edge of the leaves, all these little tiny droplets, and many of them run to the center of the leaf, which forms a little cup, creating a very large dewdrop, hence the alchemist dew. And the plant told me that alchemist dew could be used as a flower essence for both, primarily for women, but men as well, who've been sexually abused or had some type of sexual trauma. And I continue to make that one flower essence, we'll call it, because it's not really from the flower, it's the dew, based on the practices that Dr. Bach said about of how you make a flower essence. Because, of course, one of his was rock water, which was water that was in rocks. Right. And still use it and still teach my students about it. And there's no clinical trials, but I have to say that in using it over 40 some odd years, it seems to help.
Well, that's enough empirical evidence, I would say.
So there's 2 flower essence stories.
What year were you born?
I was born in 1956.
Yeah. Well, how do they know that you're not Dr. Edward Bach reincarnated anyway?
Who knows? Who knows? I don't have any clue. All I know is that I'm doing the best I can to be me.
Well, and there have been, there were so many people in, all over Europe and Australia and in Asia who were prescribing their patients to drink the dew off the tops of the flowers. So that's so wonderful that you just automatically knew that and figured that out and still practice that. I first met lady's mantle when I was traveling in Iceland, and there are so few. That's about the tallest plant there.
Really?
That and angelica. The plant life in Iceland is so short. They say if you get lost, just stand up. Wow. So can we talk a little bit about intuition? I know, it's so hard when I get someone like you on the show, because we could probably talk about a million things for days, as you said. And I wondered if we could just dive real quickly into the role of intuition in your decades of experience with the plant life, and anything you might add about your relationship with plants or plant intelligence?
Ooh, well, that opens up a whole nother area to discuss. As for intuition, one of the challenges with intuition, everybody has intuition.
Right.
This is not unique. It's not just women who have intuition. Everybody has intuition. I think women are more open to their intuition. And it is true that women have twice as many connections between the right and left hemisphere of their brain. So I think that they're definitely more attuned than many men, but there are very sensitive men as well. I think the challenge of intuition is I was always taught, and I don't know that this is true, but I believe this, but I was always taught that we have several voices that speak to us. We have what's called the heart, we have the shadow, we have our creator, and then we also have, if we're talking to plants, the plant. And so there you're talking about 4 different voices. And then the question is, who's talking? Whose voice are you actually listening to? And the challenge is for a lot of people, if they grew up in a culture where intuition is not valued and you are not taught and trained how to separate your wants from your needs and get yourself out of the process, then intuition can be challenging. I met a guy who called himself a psych herbalist. This is 35 years ago. And either he was so psychic and brilliant that I had no idea what he was doing because his protocols made no sense to me whatsoever, or he didn't know what he was doing and was pretending, or he may have believed it, that he was somehow psychic. So what I would say about intuition is it's an incredibly valuable tool, especially coming out of knowledge and experience. So intuition coming out of ignorance, I wouldn't trust very much. But when you do something for a long time, so if somebody's been in practice for 15 or 20 or 30 or 40 years, so when a patient comes in, what I'll do is they walk in the door and I look at them and I smile and I get up to greet them and shake their hand. And as soon as I sit down, in more than cases than not, I start writing things. I'll write down the name of an herb. I'll write down several things before they've told me anything, before I've looked at anything. And sometimes during the intake, I'll also write down certain things. Now, sometimes that's based on the fact that they may have told me a symptom pattern that indicates a specific herb. But other times, it's nothing I can put my finger on. And then I just kind of put that aside. And after the intake is done and they've left and I put together all of my, the diagnostics and all of the, looking at the blood work and everything, I go back and I look at that original list of things that I wrote down. And what I would say is, not all the time, but more often than not, I look at it and I go, of course. Yes, that's I agree with it. I agree. There are times where I'm like, I'm not sure where that came from, but most of the time that information is there. And at this point, while I would not necessarily, just like I don't always, I'm trained in multiple systems of herbal medicine, as you mentioned earlier. And for instance, Chinese medicine, has, it's a very, very detailed and very complex and complete system of medicine. But that doesn't mean that everything that they say in TCM, I believe in wholeheartedly. And in fact, over the years, there's certain aspects of it that I've come to conclude are just not correct, at least not based on my experience. And so the same thing's true with intuition. I honor it, I trust it, but I still try to blend between my conscious knowledge and that intuition before I just wholeheartedly dive in. Mm-hmm. Now, you asked about one other thing, and that was about plant communication. Now, one of the classes that I love to teach is called Talking Leaves, the Language of Plants. And it's basically all indigenous people everywhere in the world have a language of plants. Now, in some cases, it's been transformed, so the language of plants in China has been subsumed into traditional Chinese medicine with things like the 5 tastes and things like that. And the same thing is true of Ayurveda. But in many other cultures that don't have such a detailed tradition that's so codified, the language of plants still exists. And it is a technique by which you can determine the activity of a plant by its taste, by its color, by how it grows, by where it grows, by what it grows with, by its smell, as well as techniques that you can learn directly from the plant, which we would call the intuitive language, the ability to feel, to actually get information directly from the plant. And some people learn to do that all on their own. But it's nice for people, again, coming out of a culture that is so linear and critical as ours, to get some information so that they feel more comfortable with the process.
Mm-hmm. Would you be up for doing an experiment? Is this something that I did with one of your colleagues, Richard Mandelbaum, and I wondered if you'd be open to doing the same thing where we just sort of tune in and maybe from like a specific Rolodex of adaptogens or just whatever that pops in, if there were, because this is going against being able to double check ourselves and corroborate, but we could ask the listeners to email in and see if any of this resonates, to just take a couple seconds. And if there's, past, present, future, we can just sort of tune in to whoever might be listening and see if any plants pop in. That would be especially helpful.
Sure. Why not?
Why not? Okay, so let's take like 5 seconds and see if anything comes in. Anything come to mind?
Well, actually, a class of herbs came to mind, and 2 in specific. And the class of herbs are what are called nervines. And nervines are nerve tonics, and these are the herbs you use for people. I often use them as companion herbs to adaptogens. And this is for people who are anxious. This is for people who have trouble sleeping. They're not sedatives, these herbs. They help to nourish the nervous system. And so the 2 herbs that popped into my head, the first one was fresh oat. And fresh oat I call the queen of the nervines. And fresh oat is the herb that is used for people who are burning the candle at the top, the bottom, the middle, the back, inside and out, right and left. They are so fried, they are crispy. These are for people who become emotionally labile, where they're having number 10 reactions to number 1 problems on a constant basis. And fresh oat is a really slow-acting remedy. This isn't like you're going to take it and the next day you're going to go, oh, I'm so much better. This is a medicine you take over months, and it slowly helps to rebuild the emotional foundation. And so that was the first herb that popped into my head. And then the other one, which, I could say fresh oat is my favorite nervine. People always say to me, what's your favorite herb? It's like, for what and for who? I have so many, but I would say it's probably the nervine that I love the most. But close behind is Skullcap. And Skullcap, and you need to be sure if you get Skullcap, both fresh oat and Skullcap really only work as fresh herbs. So you make a fresh tincture out of them or a fresh glycerate. As dry herbs, they don't really have that much activity, in my opinion. Some, but much, much less. And Skullcap is used for people when they get stressed out. They develop spasms, tremors, palsies, nervous tics, muscle twitching, or fly off the handle anger. These are people who become volcanic and, people with road rage and things like that. Skullcap is just beautiful. So those are the 2 plants that popped into my head.
You want to know what I got, which is really interesting. I didn't get any specific plant names, but something popped into my head about you being a master of plants that heal wounds of the heart or that heal a broken heart.
Well, there is a formula that I make, and it is called grief relief. And grief relief combines 3 herbs. And by the way, I could say, oh, I'm so smart, I came up with this formula. I'm not so smart, and I didn't come up with this formula. The plants told me. So again, the only thing I was smart enough to do was to listen. And this formula is made up of 3 plants. The first one is a Chinese tree called Hawthorn or mimosa. And this, while it is native to China, it is commonly planted here in the United States as a ornamental shrub, or it's a small tree or shrub, and it has escaped cultivation, so it is now a major weed in the southeastern United States. The flowers can be used. They're called Hawthorn Hua, but the bark is much stronger. That's Hawthorn Pi, and it means collective happiness peel. And
Whoa.
mimosa bark is the single best mood elevator I have ever come across in my life. You give somebody mimosa bark. Now, a caveat, if somebody is bipolar, do not give them mimosa bark. It will send them into a manic phase. But for somebody who is depressed, you give them mimosa bark, and the next thing you know, they've got this big smile on their face, and they're walking around with this big smile on your face, and you say to them, hey, what's going on? Why are you so happy? And they'll look at you and go, I have no idea. I don't know why I'm smiling and my face hurts. You know, it is astonishing at how powerful this stuff is. It's incredible. And it has antidepressant activity. It has anxiolytic activity, but as I said, not for people who are bipolar. And the mimosa bark is combined with hawthorn flower and berries. And hawthorn, most people know of hawthorn, is a great cardiovascular tropho-restorative. A tropho-restorative is a food for a tissue or an organ. So therefore, a cardiac tropho-restorative is food for the heart and vascular system. And it is, but hawthorn is also an incredible nervine, which again is a nerve tonic. I especially like hawthorn for people when they get stressed out. Their blood pressure goes up. For people when they get stressed out, they develop angina, heart pain. For people who get stressed out, develop palpitations. But in Chinese medicine, the heart also stores shen. And shen, you will see in books, it's translated as spirit. That's not what it means. If you looked at a child that was very vital and alive and you say, wow, that's a spirited child, that's shen. But when Americans hear spirit, they think of the soul. All right. Well, the soul is in Chinese medicine is called the hun and the po, and that's different. So the shen is your consciousness. It's your mind. And so disturbed shen is irritability, anxiety, bad dreams. And so medicines that affect the heart basically help calm the shen. And so, for instance, one of my favorite remedies, and I never use things as simples, meaning one herb at a time, but one of my favorite things, if I had to use one thing for a kid with ADHD, it would be hawthorn solid extract. Now, good news, I don't have to use one thing. I use many things, but that would be, if I had to use one thing, that would be it, because I've seen it work even as a single remedy in some cases. And to the hawthorn berries, flowers, and mimosa bark, the last thing that is added are organic rose petals. Now, it has to be fragrant roses, and they have to be organic because commercial roses are often heavily sprayed with really nasty, pesticides and fungicides and things like that. And they have to be fragrant roses. So whether it's a cabbage rose or a damask rose or as long as it has that beautiful rose odor, it doesn't matter. And this combination is what I use to treat broken hearts. And a lot of people think broken hearts aren't real, but they are. How many times have you heard of or seen, you have a couple, they've been married happily, mostly happily, for 50 years, and he dies, and she's in good shape for her age, and within 6 months to a year, she's dead. She died of a broken heart, or he. And so broken hearts, if the person cares to, can be treated. This formula is also used for chronic grief. A lot of people in the dominant culture are afraid to grieve. They think that they have to hold it together for the kids or for this reason or for that reason. And grief is an important part of life, and it's an important process in learning. And so if we don't allow ourselves to grieve, it can become chronic. It is also, this formula is used to treat what I call stagnant depression. Now, stagnant depression, if you look in the DSM-5, which is the manual of all psychiatric diseases, you won't find the term stagnant depression. Why? Because I made it up. But I didn't make up the condition. I just created a term to describe it because there was none. And stagnant depression is basically situational depression that becomes chronic. So something bad happens in your life, and the normal response to something traumatic, depression, is a normal response. Most people over 6 months, a year and a half, and there's not a deadline. So a lot of people say, well, it's been 6 months, you should be over it. No, it takes what it takes. But for some people, they get caught up in that, and that event becomes the sun, and they are now the planet orbiting that event. And I've seen this happen, people where they get stuck and it's 10 years later, 15 years later, 20 years later,
Wow.
and they are stuck there. That is stagnant depression. They do not have the strength to escape the gravitational pull of that trauma.
Wow.
I use this formula for that as well. And finally, I use that formula for treating PTSD, which is a type of stagnant depression. The one thing I would say is if somebody, just don't give it to somebody with PTSD, because they need counseling. They need a therapist, because the formula will often allow things to come up, but they may need a lot of help processing it. So be very respectful of that and very, very careful dealing with people, at that level of emotional trauma, and make sure they're working with somebody who's a really good therapist.
And are you talking about making an infusion or a tea or a tincture?
It's a tincture.
A tincture.
Mm-hmm. But it could be made as a tea.
That's so interesting, because I'm just constantly learning. I just recently made a flower essence formula called Fierce Compassion, and part of what's in there are these, healing old wounds of the heart. And so in the versions that we add essential oils and aromatherapy to, that was one of the flowers that we added, was mimosa. I had no idea that it was so powerful herbally for the heart.
Mm-hmm.
Fascinating. Okay, so can we shift gears a little bit?
Sure.
Since you have written an incredible book about adaptogens, can we just talk about maybe a few of your favorite adaptogens that you feel most of us could benefit from?
Absolutely. But first, let me just explain to your listeners what an adaptogen is, because not everybody knows. And in fact,
Perfect.
One of the reasons I wrote my book on adaptogens is I got tired of people calling things adaptogens that aren't adaptogens. One of the challenges in the herbal community, in the American herbal community, American herbal medicine, as it exists now, is the most vibrant, vital, eclectic practice of herbal medicine on the planet. But that also means that a lot of Western trained herbalists have no real deep foundation, and they have it's a little of this, it's a little of that. And it even goes down to the point of a lack of consensus about some of our terminology. For those of us who know how incredible herbs are and how powerfully healing they can be, if we want to share that with the rest of the world, which brings me to that, I have a dream if we have time.
Absolutely.
If we want to share that with the rest of the world, it would behoove us, I think, to at least come to some consensus about what some terms mean. Now, the term adaptogen, I did a post on my Facebook thing where I post on a regular basis about herbs. And in the post, I was describing adaptogen and some of the new research on adaptogens. And one of the responses I got was somebody saying, so now scientists are telling us what an adaptogen is? And it's like, well, yeah, because they created the whole concept. This didn't come from the herbal community. It came from Soviet researchers. This is an idea that they came up with. So yeah, they do get to determine what an adaptogen is. And what we now know is initially the Dr. Breckman, who is considered the father of adaptogenic research, said an adaptogen had three primary qualities. Number one, they were pretty much non-toxic in a normal therapeutic dose. Number two, they created a non-specific state of resistance in the body, meaning you're resistant to a wide variety of stressors, irregardless of whether they're psychological stress or physiological stress. And physiological stress can be noise, temperature, a whole range of things. And they act as basically systemic trophorestoratives, helping to re-regulate function in the body in general. So those were the original three categories that define an adaptogen, but that's really, it's not precise. So later on, Dr. Panosian and Dr. Wagner, who are probably the world's two great authorities on adaptogens today, have come up with some additional things that denote a plant is or is not an adaptogen. Number one, an adaptogen works through two of the major regulatory systems in the body, and these are the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which controls all endocrine function, a significant amount of nervous system function, immune function, cardiac function, as well as digestive function, and something called the SAS, the sympathoadrenal system, which is your fight or flight mechanism. So the fight or flight mechanism deals with acute stress, whereas the HPA axis deals with chronic stress. So if an herb is not primarily working through the HPA axis and the SAS, it's not an adaptogen.
Okay, let me just stop you to make sure it's totally layman's terms. An herb to be an adaptogen must be working on both long-term and short-term acute stress.
Yes.
Okay.
But by affecting those two systems in the body.
Gotcha.
Okay. And then more recently, probably about 5 years ago, they realized that adaptogens are doing something else, and they are working on a cellular basis. And I'm not going to get into all the details because it's very complicated, but suffice to say, what adaptogens are doing, number one, is they are reducing cortisol, which is our major stress hormone, but they are upregulating other chemical messengers in the body that respond to stress. So taking an adaptogen is a little bit like getting a vaccine, a stress vaccine. What it does to the body is it says, stress is coming, so get ready. So instead, it's like if you go to the gym, you don't go to the gym and try to bench press 300 pounds if you have not been in the gym for 20 years. You start off light and you work your way up until so your muscles get stronger and more able to deal with more weight. And that's what adaptogens are doing to basically on our cellular level. That's what they are doing. So we are better able to deal with stress, more appropriately deal with stress. And they prevent stress-induced mitochondrial dysfunction. The mitochondria are the engines of our cells. Chronic stress shuts down the mitochondria. Adaptogens prevent it. So in order for an herb to be an adaptogen, it has to do all of those things.
It sounds like a lot. And these herbs sound like miraculous herbs that, all of us would want to incorporate into our everyday lives.
I would say that the average American probably could use an adaptogen or two, but here's the thing.
Okay.
All adaptogens are not created equal, meaning there are adaptogens that are stimulating, like rhodiola and Asian ginseng. There are adaptogens that are calming, like ashwagandha or Schizandra. There are adaptogens that are nourishing, like American ginseng or the Chinese herb Codonopsis. There are adaptogens that are heating, again, like Asian ginseng, especially the red Asian ginseng. There are adaptogens that are cooling. So if somebody has, a lot of heat conditions in their body, you don't want to give them a hot adaptogen. There are ones that are drying. There's ones that are moistening. And so the key is, and one of the other reasons I wrote my book on adaptogens with monographs on all the adaptogenic herbs. And by the way, I am currently working on the second edition, which will hopefully be out next year. Took long enough, but nevertheless, the idea is which adaptogen is right for you.
Right.
So it's not that everybody needs a adaptogen, it's which adaptogen makes sense for you. And so that, in my mind, is really important because, they are not universal. They're not, each one is good for everybody. One is going to be more appropriate to a given person. So if you're the kind of person that's really anxious and has trouble sleeping, then the last thing you want to do is take a stimulating adaptogen because it's going to make that worse. So there you'd want a calming adaptogen, something like the Ayurvedic herb ashwagandha, which is a wonderful calming adaptogen. It also helps relieve musculoskeletal pain. So I use it all the time for treating chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome and fibromyalgia. But ashwagandha also stimulates the thyroid. So for somebody who is hypothyroid, ashwagandha is very appropriate for several reasons. But for somebody who's hyperthyroid, don't give them ashwagandha.
What about for a person who is, you'd think they need a stimulating adaptogen because they have no energy. But at the same time, they are, like you said, burning the candle from every angle. And so what they may need is more nourishing.
Yeah, somebody like that, they may need a more nourishing adaptogen. And depending on things like their age, their constitution. So for instance, American ginseng happens to be a slightly warming, moistening, and nourishing adaptogen. And I especially like using American ginseng for people who are, say, 40 to 60. Now, that's not a hard and fast rule. If I have a 24-year-old with chronic fatigue immune deficiency syndrome who's exhausted, I might give him or her American ginseng. But often I'm using it for people who are more 40 to 60, and they started to notice things are changing, meaning they don't have the same level of vitality. If they don't get, have a night where they don't get enough sleep, they feel it much more than they did in the past. They start feeling more sensitive to weather changes, and especially cold. Jet lag is worse. And so for people like that, I might use something like American ginseng. And one really important thing to say about American ginseng is it is an endangered species. So for all of our listeners, please do not buy wild American ginseng. Buy organically grown American ginseng. That way it has been, and especially woods grown, meaning it's grown in its natural habitat and it's being grown for use rather than being harvested out of the wild.
Good to know. And that's primarily grown in places like Wisconsin?
Wisconsin is, Wisconsin, they grow American ginseng. A lot of that is not woods grown, although some of it may be. I know there's a ginseng farm in Maryland that grows woods grown ginseng. There are places all over. There are farms in North Carolina and Tennessee, and so they're around, but you have to look for it. So if somebody's selling something that says wild American ginseng, say no, thank you.
Gotcha. And any other adaptogens that should definitely be a part of this conversation before we move on to synergy?
Well, other adaptogens. Interestingly enough, there are only 8 adaptogens that I would call well-researched adaptogens. Then, which is a very small number, there's another 10 that are what I call probable adaptogens, and then an even larger group that are possible adaptogens that may be, but the evidence is not very good. Another plant, it's very commonly used that I will mention is Schizandra. The Chinese name is Wuezi, which means 5-flavor fruit, and it has all 5 flavors, but the predominant ones are sour and turpentine. So it's somewhat of an acquired taste. It is
super
also
sour.
It is also a calming adaptogen for most people, although I would say 1 out of 100 people will get stimulated by it. For the most part, it's calming, enhances the quality of sleep, but it does something really unusual. Generally speaking, it leaves you feeling calm, alert, and focused. When we hear the words alert and focused, we tend to bundle that with things like caffeine. Stimulants make you feel alert and focused, but this makes you feel calm, alert, and focused. So traditionally, it was drunk as a tea before you meditate, because alert, calm, and focused is perfect for meditation. It is actually not bad for studying before big tests and things like that, or before public speaking, because it doesn't put you to sleep. It just makes you feel calm, alert, and focused. In addition, it has profound anti-inflammatory activity. It is hepatoprotective, so it protects the liver against damage from chemicals, viruses, etc. It is a profound herb. It is anti-asthmatic activity, so it's used for people who have asthma with wheezing. And most importantly, not really, but importantly, it astringes the Jing. Now, in Chinese medicine, Jing is associated with seminal fluid in men and either urine or vaginal discharge in women. So you know what they say, it don't mean a thing if you don't got the Jing, and you do not want to be Jing-free. So if you have a leaky Jing gate, if you have urinary frequency or heavy non-specific vaginal discharge, not associated with any type of STD or infection or anything, just a heavy discharge, or even fecal incontinence, or in TCM, premature ejaculation, which, by the way, doesn't really work very well for that. But for all these other things, you want to astringe that leaky gingate. And so Schizandra is used for that. Talk about an herb with a lot of uses.
No kidding. Oh my God. And I've also heard that it's good for beauty or radiance, or is there some sort of like lore about women drinking Schizandra tea for radiance or beauty?
I think where that comes from is if you have a leaky gingate, your life force is in the jing. So if you're losing jing, you're going to age much faster. And so I think it probably comes from that, because by astringing that leaky jingate, you're going to hold on to your life force. Most people think in Chinese medicine, qi is the life force. It's not. Jing is the life force, the essence.
Love that. Okay, beautiful. Can we take a little turn and talk about synergy?
Yeah. So people always say to me, they say, if I want to be an herbalist, and of course I have a 2-year herb studies program, and one of the first things I ask people is I'll say to them, who in the room wants to be a good herbalist? And everybody raises their hand. And then what I say is, wrong answer. Because if you're going to be an herbalist, if you're going to be a physician, if you're going to be a house painter, if you're going to be an artist, if you're going to be whatever it is you are, don't be good, be great. And each of us has the potential to be great in our own unique way. It's not about comparison. It's not about, are you as good as somebody else? We all have the potential to be great. And we hear all the time about American exceptionalism. I sadly often see what I call American unexceptionalism. So many people content to be mediocre, to be what in the South they say, make and do, getting by. Well, I think especially if you're going to be working with other people and their health, then you need to do the best you can to be really great. And if you want to be a great herbalist, there are a couple of things that people need to understand. Number one, you need to understand about energetics, the energetics of the herb, whether it's hot or cold or warming and drying. And that's how you match the herb up to the person. And then, of course, human energetics, i.e. diagnostics, so that, again, you can know if this herb formula is appropriate to that person. So that's really important. And then another thing that is essential in my mind to people being great as herbalists is synergy. And in all of the world's great herbal traditions, so traditional Chinese medicine, TCM, Ayurveda from India, Kampo from Japan, Unani Tib from the Middle East, Jamu from Indonesia, Tibetan medicine, in all these great herbal traditions, synergy is baked into this idea that by skillfully combining herbs, 1 + 1 no longer equals 2. 1 + 1 equals 3. Or 4 or 5. And in one study I saw recently, adding one herb with a second herb increased its bioavailability by 2,000%.
Wow.
So, and throwing a bunch of herbs together in a formula does not guarantee synergy. In fact, there's anti-synergy, i.e. antagonism. So it's understanding how to match herbs up together, to match them to the person, to create a formula that is going to have incredible activity as well as safety for that person. And so, as I said, energetics, differential diagnostics, the idea of synergy. And then one last thing I would say, if somebody wants to be a great herbalist, you have to learn how to listen. Listening becomes really important. And I would say opening yourself up to your heart and your intuition is probably equally important. But all of those things, I think, can combine to make somebody, really exceptional in what they do.
And when you say listening, what do you mean?
Well, I suppose intuition can be an aspect of listening, but I'm talking about actually listening. I tend to find, and this is not always true, but I tend to find women are better listeners than men. And so, especially for men, but this is true of everybody, we like to talk a lot, but we don't listen as much. And so, as a practitioner, if you want to be good, you have to listen not only to what somebody says, but how they say it, the words they use. Don't be so eager to jump in and tell the person what you think. Let them tell you their story. And so when you say to somebody, well, how's your relationship? And they go, oh, it's really good. And they're clenching their teeth, they're clenching their hands. Well, obviously not. To read body language, to listen. And of course, as a practitioner, there's also something that's really important. It's known as the healing relationship. And that is the relationship between the practitioner and the person who they are seeing. And I don't use the word healer for people. I don't believe people, honestly, are healers. I think we have what my uncle called the inner doctor. That's that, whether you call it your immune system or that body's ability to heal, and the creator and the plants. Those, in my mind, whether we're talking about flower essences or whether we're talking about herbs or whatever, those are the healers. And as practitioners, I think we're teachers. We're teachers, we're guides, and we can try to help people on their healing journey, but we don't actually do that work. We are sort of intermediaries because perhaps they don't really know a whole lot about flower essences, or they don't know a whole lot about herbs or diet or nutrition or whatever. So we can help them in that process, but we're assistants. We're there to help them in the process, but we are not, the creators of that process.
Mm-hmm. Kind of like a catalyst. And I wondered, I know that we're probably coming to the end of our time here, but if you would like to talk a little bit about your dream.
I would thank you so much for giving me that opportunity. When I first started studying herbs in the late 1960s, there was a long period of time where I thought I was the only herbalist on the East Coast. Now, I was wrong. There were other ones, hidden mostly in small, rural and ethnic communities, but there were other people, but it was really lonely.
I bet.
And coming out of this, what I call the herbal dark ages, I came up with this idea. And the idea is I have a dream. Now, of course, everybody's heard those words before by somebody far more eloquent than I, but I actually have a dream too. And I hope that within my lifetime, because coming from a time where herbal medicine was so far out in left field, it was in another field, people just didn't even have any understanding what I was talking about. The dream is this: I would like to see a time where herbs regain their rightful place as part of not medicine, but as part of mainstream American culture. I would like to see a time where almost every mom and dad, grandmother and grandfather knows basic kitchen herbal medicine for their families, where there are community herbalists in every community and clinical herbalists available in any clinical setting, so that herbs can actually really be utilized in the best way that they can be, not only for prevention of disease, but treatment of disease. A lot of people think it's some type of a battle between orthodox medicine and alternative medicine, and that is not true. I've been in practice for 42 years, and in that entire time, I have always worked with physicians. I love working with physicians because what they do well is not what I do well. And in fact, where herbal medicine is strong is where orthodox medicine tends to be weak, and vice versa. Where orthodox medicine is strong, herbal medicine tends to be weak. So the true win-win in my experience is, for the patient, is a great physician matched with a great herbalist or flower essence practitioner or whatever other modality you have, because then they can talk amongst themselves and figure out what's most appropriate for that person at any given time. Nobody has a lock on the truth. My uncle used to say, the problem with truth is every tradition and every practice has this much truth. All right, so I'm making, people can see it, I'm making a circle with my hand. And the problem becomes is when you start looking at it like this and you think you've got all the truth. None of us has all the truth. We each have our piece. And hopefully in the case of what we're talking about today, each of us is contributing our part to make our patients healthier, our families healthier, our communities healthier, and the planet healthier.
Mm. Well, I very much support your dream coming true as well. And for those people who also support your dream and want to jump in head first to learn more about herbs, where can we get more of you in terms of your teachings, your classes, your programs?
All right. Well, for my 2-year herb studies program, they can go to herbalstudies.net, and the website is there, and there's recommended reading lists for people who just want to get a great list of herb books that I think are really wonderful. And then for people who are, and also on that site, you can also get all my classes and conferences that I'm teaching at. And then my other website is herbaltherapeutics.net. And there you can get whole books that you can download from my library for free. Again, listings of all my classes and workshops and things like that. And then if anybody's interested in herbal products, my company is herbalist-alchemist.com. And we work very hard at creating absolutely superb herbal medicines. We started off making them for my patients, and now we make them for anybody who'd like them.
Love it. Okay. Thank you for sharing all those websites. I noticed that you're going to be teaching later this year quite a bit in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one last question, or maybe second to last question. Are there any plants that you are currently in conversation with right now that are sort of new and fresh or old and beloved, or, plants that are in your psyche?
Well, for me, a lot of times it has to do with either what's in bloom at my house.
Right.
So for instance, this past week, the peonies are in bloom and the irises are in bloom.
Wow.
And these are 2 flowers, but are both medicines as well, that I absolutely love. And so the blue flag or iris is a low dose herb. So this is not something that people should, at home play with. You need to know how to use it.
Right.
But it is a very strong, what is known as alterative. These are herbs that enhance normal eliminatory function and are used to treat mostly chronic degenerative disease. But I find, especially my old-fashioned irises that I brought from my old farm to here, they have this incredible odor. They are just magnificent. So when they are in bloom, I just go out every day and smell them. And it's a strange odor. I don't know how to describe it. I think of it as a combination of kind of cinnamon and bubble gum. But I just find it magical, and I just love smelling them. And then the peonies, a couple of them are still, some of them did their full bloom last week, but some of them are still blooming now. And peony, especially the unhybridized peony, which in Chinese medicine is called Bai Xiao Yao, is really easy to grow. The flowers are magnificent, and the roots are used as medicine. Now, they need to be, you every 3 or 4 years, you dig them up and you cut the roots, and some of them you replant, that have a nice bud on them for the next year. And one plant can become 10 plants, but there's almost always extra left over. And you take that white peony, the peony root, you dip it in boiling water for about a minute, and the outer bark peels off. You slice it, dry it, and that becomes the Chinese herb Bai Xiao Yao, or white peony, which is one of the major blood tonics, shu tonics in Chinese medicine. And it is used in a lot of Chinese formulas for female reproductive issues such as amenorrhea, a lack of menstrual cycle, painful menstruation, fibroids, ovarian cysts, things like that. But it is also a phenomenal medicine for enhancing cerebral circulation. So it can be used for things like menopausal brain fog or just somebody who's just cloudy thinking. It is also a wonderful herb for helping to relieve musculoskeletal pain. So I must always combine it with things like ashwagandha for treating fibromyalgia. It is a marvelous plant, and it is one that many Western herbalists don't know about because it's a Chinese herb, except that it's one that grows here very commonly, and it's not hard to get the unhybridized peony, so that you can grow it yourself, and you can get medicine from it in 2 ways. Number one, from enjoying the beauty of the flowers, and I have to imagine somebody somewhere must have made a flower essence out of it, although I don't know what it would be used for. It's just too magnificent a flower.
We have.
What's it used for? Tell me. I learned something new.
It's kind of like when you know that feeling when you just bury your face in that huge peony. It's it's like that feeling. It's abundance, gratitude, totally uninhibited, like let loose, almost just like how it looks, like big and lush and dissolving any sort of patterns of lack, not enoughness, that kind of thing. Just
Nice.
Full and total abundance.
Well, thank you for teaching me something new. It's a good game.
Oh my gosh. I just love talking to you, David. This is so much fun.
Well, I have enjoyed it immensely. This is one of the best conversations I've had in a really long time. So if you ever want to do it again, you got my number.
Oh my gosh. I think we should do a whole other episode. We could, what we can do is, if any of you who are listening right now are just absolutely in love and fascinated and you've come up with some questions, if you can send those to podcast@lotuswei.com, if you have questions specifically for David, and then we'll see how many questions roll in and we can schedule another one for whenever we have time. And then we'll have some really specific questions for you from our listeners. Again, we'll post all 3 of those websites to get more information about David and his incredible work. We'll post those on the post about the podcast. And just to sort of wrap up, if there's any last question for you, David, is if there's any insights, nuggets of wisdom, or things that you just recently commonly find yourself sharing with people.
I'm going to be teaching this weekend at a conference. It's a new conference in Pennsylvania called Allies for Plants and People, put on by a former student of mine. Her name is Karis, and she does a wonderful job. And I'm going to be doing the keynote talk. And keynotes, of course, are always a little bit different than teaching a class because, of course, one of the aspects of keynotes is that they're supposed to be inspirational. And one of the things that I find is that plants inspire me. They absolutely do, and as you get older, I had this conversation. I was teaching last weekend in North Carolina at the Medicines from the Earth conference, and a bunch of my friends, colleagues, and we were sitting around talking, and, we're all getting older, and I'm not as ambitious as I used to be. I don't have as much energy as I used to be, but I have to tell you, my love of plants, my passion for plants, my passion for sharing about plants and just turning people on to the fact that these medicines on all different levels, physically, emotionally, and spiritually, can make an incredible difference in our lives. Are they panaceas? Can they help everything? No. But in so many ways, they have so many benefits. I am just so, again, feel so blessed and so fortunate that I found my passion early, that this is a passion that will sustain me through my entire life. And I just want to share it with people. So if you're new to plants, somebody is just kind of getting into herbs and things like that, it starts with one. You don't need to know everything. And yes, it may seem overwhelming. Oh my God, I don't know what a, hypothalamus is. Okay, don't worry about it. Start with one plant. Start with lemon balm. Start with plantain. Start with drinking your chamomile tea. Start with your peppermint. Start with one plant. Learn about that. Work with it. Use it. Eat it. Make medicine out of it. And then you learn 2 plants, and then 3, and then 4. And what I think of plants, they're a little bit like in herbal medicine. It's a little bit like getting the best virus in the world. You just get it, and then you want to spread it to everybody. So,
wow, love that. Thank you so much for your time. It was brilliant conversation. Thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Thank you again so much for listening to the Flowerlounge podcast. Wanted to let you know we're super excited. We just launched our very first crowdfunding campaign on Indiegogo. Any contribution helps, even if it's $1. We just would love to see your name on the contributor list. It warms my heart to know that there are so many people contributing to this vision that we have. You can check that out on our website and find the crowdfunding campaign from there at the top of the page. And we have a retreat coming up in Costa Rica in November. There are only a few spots left. If any of you want to take a last-minute trip, you need a week of luscious downtime on the beach, in the jungle, I also just invited Erin Borbet. She'll be offering one-on-one acupuncture treatments while we're there, as well as Robin Sandomirsky, who will be offering luminary intuitive sessions. And it's going to be an amazing week. So if you're interested in that, check out earthaura.com. And we thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for listening to The Flower Lounge. I'm Katie Hess, and we'll be releasing a new podcast every Wednesday. If you like what you heard, or you know someone who might be touched by our conversation, share it with them. And don't forget to subscribe. To find out what your favorite flowers mean about you, take the quiz at LOTUSWEI.com.